I have no idea why I volunteered for the midnight shift. The extra 40 cents an hour wasn't really worth it. Everyone that I was working with had good reasons to not take the shift that week. Me, being the nice person that I am, took the shift that no one wanted. If I didn't, I would have gone to someone with less seniority in the company. And I knew that everyone below me either had kids to look after or college classes. The person who was meant for the midnight shift had a medical emergency the day before, and it was such short notice that I knew it was causing problems. They had to find a body to fill the shift, and I stepped in knowing it would be a hassle for others to change their schedule around. I really should be more selfish in the future. My job was out of the town that I lived. Because of that, I had to drive at least an hour on the highway each way. It was 2 hours of my days listening to audiobooks or podcasts, so it wasn't a huge waste. Plus, the pay was stupid high for such an easy job. I couldn't really complain about the drive. But even so, I found the highway at night super creepy. For long stretches, there was nothing but endless trees on either side of the road. Driving in the pitch dark, only being able to see a few feet in front of you. And most of that few feet were just trees, and it wasn't pleasant. At least for me. I watched the Blair Witch at far too young of an age. I know it's not a scary movie for anyone else, but seeing trees at nighttime, no thank you. But somehow, my kindness outshone my fear of the woods. I was driving in for my shift at around 11:30 p.m. I needed to speed if I would make it to work by midnight. But I saw something that I could not ignore. On the side of the road, I saw a car pulled over and the driver's side door open. I didn't see anyone around the car as I came up on it. I saw the car was a taxi, and that gave off some red flags. A few months ago, my car needed to be taken in for some work. I hitched a ride with a coworker, and we got talking just how expensive it would have been if we got a taxi or an Uber to work, even for just one night. I didn't even want to think about how much it would cost if the taxi went by the meter. I had heard that sometimes they do a flat rate between cities, but once you're off the highway, the meter starts. I never bothered to find out if it was true. Seeing a taxi on the highway was weird enough. Seeing a taxi on the east side of the highway, top light on and door open, with no one around was super weird. I think anyone would think that. But I may be the only person to pull over and see what was going on. I was already going to be late for work, but I knew it would bother me if I didn't at least check to see if someone needed help. I pulled over, but I already passed the taxi when I decided to stop. Instead of backing up, I just got out of my car, taking my cell phone and flashlight out from my trunk. This could be some sort of scam. A way to get people to pull over to be robbed. But I honestly never heard of that happening. Like ever. At least not where I lived. And my flashlight weighed at least 5 pounds. I could get a good hit on someone if I had to, and I could just make a run for it. Kicking up dust as I walked over, I could tell something was very wrong even before I had reached the car. I hadn't noticed before, but one of the back doors were open as well. I already had my phone out, and I dialed trying to get help on the way, but I only got static, which I thought was also very weird. I've never had issues with a signal out on the highway. My phone connected to my car. It would read text messages while I was driving. A signal had never been an issue before. I think any normal person would have just laughed, but I guess I'm stupid. I looked inside the car looking for anyone or anything that would explain why the car was just sitting there. My stomach dropped when I saw some red. I knew it was blood over the driver's seat. I shone my flashlight on the ground to follow a trail of blood droplets, with some hurried footprints leading off into the woods. It wasn't a lot of blood, but it wasn't a little either. Someone was hurt, but it was hard to tell how badly. I looked in the back of the taxi trying to find a weapon, but I didn't touch the car. I just leaned over, trying to get a good look inside. The window of the rear door that was open had been smashed. Glass littered the back seat, and it had spilled onto the ground outside of the taxi. Something had happened, and I still couldn't get my phone to work. And that was when I heard it. A scream. A man screaming for help from inside of the woods. He sounded close enough for me to reach him. After everything I had seen, and now heard, I really should have ditched the whole thing. But like I said, I'm not the brightest. Stay there, I shouted back. I'm coming to help. Without a second thought, I took off running into the woods after where I thought I had heard the scream from. And it honestly was my worst nightmare. In the woods at night, it's unsettling. I don't know how people go camping. My flashlight was bulky and I had a good beam of light, but it could only go so far into the woods. The darkness where my light could not reach made my palms sweat. I couldn't stand not knowing what was out there in the dark looking back at me. I scolded myself mentally, saying the only thing out there is someone who needs help. It was only when I was a few feet into the woods and to the point where I couldn't see the light of the taxi was when what I had actually just done sunk in. If a man was hurt out here, what had hurt him? Who had hurt him? It wasn't just him. Someone broke the window. Someone had been in the back seat and I only had a hefty flashlight and a cell phone. That wasn't even working. I wanted to find the man and get the heck out of there. When I heard something else. A woman's voice. Please, can you help me find my son? I looked around, trying to figure out where the voice had came from. My beam of light scanning the dark trees, but seeing nothing besides the creepy trees that I hated. Please, can you help me find my son? The voice came again and then again. She repeated herself 3 times and fell silent. I started to shake. I just couldn't help it. The woman's voice sounded off. Have you ever seen that video of a bird talking in Japanese? It sounds so human and yet not. So close to human speech, but the tone is so slightly off you're aware that you're not talking to a human. That woman's voice sounded human, and yet not. Run! I screamed at the voice. Of course I screamed. An older man came running out from the trees, his lip torn and still bleeding. He rushed past me and made a grab for my arm to drag me along. He missed but didn't even pause in running to try again. He just ran, trying not to trip over fallen branches and tree roots. He looked like a man who just saw death himself. I was so shocked still seeing him. I may not have ran after him if an ear-piercing scream hadn't come from behind me. That sound motivated me to run fast as I could from behind that man. That scream, that sound, I still hear in my nightmares. Or even if I just let myself sit in silence for too long. I've listened to over hundreds of wildlife recordings trying to prove to myself that I'd heard an escaped exotic pet. Or anything that would logically explain that scream that I heard. It wasn't made by a human or an animal. It was nothing that I have ever heard since, and I hope to never hear again. And it was right behind me. I somehow caught up to the man. I felt like we had run so far and yet we hadn't reached the road yet. I had to stop because my chest burned from running. We both stood, gasping for air from fear, and from running through the hard-to-navigate forest floor. The flashlight beam was powerful enough to light his face covered with blood, even if I wasn't pointing it directly at him. He nervously ran a hand over his face. It didn't wipe off anything, only getting his face bloodier. I had only heard a voice and a scream. I didn't want to know what this man had seen in the woods. We need to keep going. I told him once I was able to talk again. It's not my fault. He was running his bloody hand through his hair, clearly out of his mind from fright. I wanted to reach out to try and calm him down, but wasn't sure if that would only upset him more. I decided to let him talk while I looked around trying to find a way out of the trees. "It's not my fault. I mean, she's pretty. She was pretty. She got into my cab, right? You understand?" By some miracle, I had spotted a light through the trees. I was positive it came from the taxi from the road. I was just about to tell the man that we needed to walk in that direction, but what he was saying made me stop. I had never been so afraid in my life being in those woods, but I still stopped to look over at him. "What are you talking about?" I asked slowly. "Girls like that don't mean no, right? If they are so nice like that and smile at you like that, they want it, right? I didn't even do anything. I just parked. I didn't even get into the back seat. She was the one who leaned over. She bit my lips off. She was the one who wanted it." As he spoke, his voice got more and more frantic. I stood in place, watching him lose it. He was running his hand through his hair, tearing at it. His body shook and his eyes darted around wildly. "That woman isn't human," he shouted. He grabbed at his head with both hands and started to sob. This man. I didn't want to think of what would have happened to the woman in the back of his taxi if she was human. If he had just picked up a normal person that night, what would he have done? Over his sobbing, I heard a branch crack, and then another. I raised my flashlight to look into the darkness, and I finally saw her. She was pretty. That much was true, and also not human. Long brown hair fell over her shoulders. She was only wearing a flower print sundress with the driver's blood down the front. Her face looked normal, aside from her eyes. They were eyes of a dead woman, blind and pale. She was only a few steps away from us. The sobbing man hadn't noticed her creep up behind him. She stood in the beam of the flashlight, almost curious what I would do. I did something that I never expected of myself. While keeping the flashlight on the woman, I took a step back, and then another. The taxi driver was in so much distress he didn't notice me slowly backing away from him. It was only when I was a decent distance away from them was when the driver had finally raised his head. I saw the horror on his face when he noticed that I was now so far away from him. Almost in slow motion, I watched as he reached out a hand for me, and at the same time, the woman took him. Her mouth ripped open, causing her head to look like a demonic Pez toy. With her hands suddenly long claws, she grabbed his shoulder and latched onto his neck. Her eyes stayed on me the entire time. Blood soaked the front of the driver's shirt before he could even make a sound. That woman never took her dead eyes off of me as she tore flesh away from the man. I did not stay around to see her rip him apart. I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the light coming from the taxi. I got out of the woods without being followed. I kept running to my car and I flew in. My hands were shaking too much to even start the thing. On reflex, I checked my phone. I saw that I had a signal, and without any delay, I called the police. I don't know why I stayed in my car, or why I didn't just leave after reporting my story. Even in my state, I knew I couldn't tell the truth. I told the operator that I had spotted the taxi pulled over, saw some blood, and when I was about to go into the woods to try and help, I heard screaming that it freaked me out, and I ran back to my car. Even after the cops had showed up, they just took my story again and my info and then dismissed me. I was very late for work, but after telling my bosses a very abridged version of the night's events, they forgave me. I still have trouble sleeping. I no longer do midnight shifts, and I hate driving along the highway before the sun comes up on my early morning shifts. Later on, I looked up the case, but I didn't find many details. They only found some of the remaining blood from the driver, but it was still enough for them to be positive that he was dead. I was not a suspect, even though I had found the car. I looked up the driver's name once I had found it out and saw that he had assaulted other women before. He had just been released and wasn't even a real taxi driver. They had no idea where he got the taxi from, but the police were sure that he was just using it to hunt other women. A bit of information about the case that made it impossible to sleep at night was who the woman was. They found her DNA on the broken window glass. The thing was, she had disappeared 3 years ago and was assumed dead. She had gone missing in the woods with her son. Maybe I should get a new job, one much closer to home.